All right, thank you so much for joining us, and I will let Sanji introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Natalie, and welcome everyone. Hopefully you are tuned in to the right webinar, Developing and Managing a Conflict of Interest Policy. So if that is the webinar that you're looking for, you have tuned in to the right one. If not, this may be a great opportunity for you to find where you're supposed to be. But without further ado, I would just like to give a little bit of background history on our today's presenter, Megan Johnston. Megan brings 25 years of experience as an executive leader, a board member, a facilitator, and capacity building consultant to her firm's work with nonprofit organizations. She has worked directly with CAA's board, policy councils, and executive team, and is a frequent presenter at state associations and national conference settings. Usually her presentation involves focusing on strategic and sustainability planning, governance and training development, and she also does presentations on leadership coaching and skill building with emerging leaders. So that's just a little bit of background history on our today's speaker. She has done so much more than what I've just shared with you, but that just gives you a bird's eye view of what a great presenter she is and how she is very familiar with community action and the work that we do here. So without further ado, I would like to turn it over to Megan Johnston.
Thanks, Sanji, and welcome everybody to our discussion on conflict of interest. This was billed as relating to conflict of interest policy, and we'll be talking about that, of course, as a framework. But even more than that, and probably more important, we'll be talking about the culture that you have an opportunity to develop in your organization about conflicts that really can be a positive thing. People tend to view conflict of interest as a negative or a limitation, and I'm hoping that by the time we're finished here today, if we do our job well, you'll be seeing it as somewhat of an opportunity. The major purpose of the webinar today is really to talk about protective measures for organizations, but I don't want this to be taken in as a defensive gesture. We'll really be looking for the risk management procedures that you can use in conflict of interest, because that's a very key piece of an overall risk management approach. And in terms of my role in conflict of interest and with organizations in policy development and implementation, I'm often brought in by organizations to help them with policy development, or often to screen their policies in the context of another process. So many of the examples that I'll give you today are from my experience both in that setting and as a board member in various settings with not-for-profits. So I do have real examples to offer to you, but I also want to caution you that some of the things that I will raise are worst-case scenarios. I want you to be prepared for risks and for things that can go wrong at the same time that you're building and improving your culture. So I do want to start with a poll of the audience. I just want a little bit of background about you, and it would help to tailor my examples to know whether you're developing a new or an updated policy, whether you're looking more at the cultural aspects of conflict of interest, or whether you have a history either with a current conflict or some past history of conflicts that has caused stress or poor relationships within your organization, or if you have another reason for being here, perhaps just general interest.
So you should be able to see the poll on the right side of your screen. And we have about 20 seconds left before we close the poll. And then we'll show those answers.
Okay. Thank you for responding. So we have a number of folks that are interested in the policy aspect. and also folks that are here for another reason, presumably general interest in the topic or because they have specific questions. We have a low number of folks that are currently dealing with a conflict or have had a poor history of conflict, which is great to hear. Okay, let's move along then. Things that we'll cover today and that by the time we finish up you will have background information on, or the process of identifying a conflict. This is particularly important because it's difficult to identify conflicts, and I've rarely met a group of people who agree on how to go about identifying a conflict. So setting some parameters in place and learning about the questions that we ask in facing a potential conflict will be the first thing that we'll work on. The second is to talk really about who cares about this and why is now a particularly important time for this issue. And we'll go through a number of conflicts that are common to community action. While there are many conflicts that arise in community action that also happen in other not-for-profits all the time, there are some that are fairly specific to community action. And these may relate to things like conflicts that arise out of the makeup of the tripartite board, or conflicts or potential conflicts or perceptions of conflicts that arise when members of the board are also users of service within the organization. So we'll look at some of those. We'll then move on to talk about the elements of a good conflict of interest policy, and we'll reinforce those as well as some of the strategies that we can use to manage conflicts productively and also manage your risk. Well, also throughout the presentation, I'll be showing you links to some resources that might be helpful for you in follow-up, and at the end of the presentation, we'll also see some additional resources. Okay, so let's look at the definition of conflict of interest, and we have another poll here. If you can look through these questions and let me know which one you believe fits us best in terms of a way to describe a conflict of interest that would help you and your board members or key staff people determine when one is happening. So 3 different definitions. Let's weigh in on which one appeals to you. It looks like the poll is open.
Again, that poll should be showing up on the right side of your screen. If you have any technical issues, you can send me a message through the chat window. Thanks for participating.
We have a majority of folks that either looked at B as the definition that agreed with them, or we're not sure about which definition might work. So let's tease out the pieces of this. One of the things that this process of looking at definition helps us with is learning what questions to ask when we are trying to figure out what is a conflict and what is not. So let's look at those pieces of a good definition. Any of the 3 of these get to some aspect of conflict of interest. Item B, which actually a number of you chose, is actually the official IRS definition of a conflict of interest. Now, we'll talk later about what the IRS has to say about conflict, but let me just say now that the IRS definition and the IRS policies and requirements are necessary but not sufficient to your understanding of conflict of interest. So this is a good basic definition. There's a lot more to it. The IRS does have some specific requirements that we'll talk about shortly, but there are other layers that go on conflict of interest when you are trying to come up with a policy that works for you in your community action agency with your particular package of funders and in your particular state. So number A here talks about compromising the board member or key staff member's duty of loyalty, and a couple of you thought that was a good definition. It is in the sense that it references the duty of loyalty, which of course is the legal requirement of board members as fiduciaries, that they make decisions that demonstrate their loyalty first, their primary loyalty being to that organization. So that's a key piece of conflict of interest, as is the duty of care, which of course is the board member's duty to pay attention, to do good research, to be an active participant in conversations, and in general to use that reasonable person standard or the business judgment rule. So those are important concepts that come through in that definition. Definition C, which a couple of people did choose also, gets to the issue, but the giveaway here is that a conflict of interest does not always damage the organization. And it's, again, that sort of negative view of conflict of interest that we often take. And sometimes that gets in the way of us really figuring out what is a manageable conflict and how can we keep the light shined on those things so that things do not appear to be insider discussions or things that are really kept in the dark and can damage culture in the organization. So let's go ahead and look at one more definition, and this one gets to two concepts that I want you to keep in mind as we go through the rest of the presentation. And those concepts are influence and benefit. So an actual or potential conflict occurs according to this definition when either an employee, an officer, or a director is in a position to influence the decision. So that will be one of the questions that we ask when we look at scenarios. Is this board member in a position to influence this decision? And then will they receive personal benefit from the decision? And of course, family members, and this we'll talk about in some depth because part of the Head Start regulations and many other statutes and regulations that affect you very closely define family members that would be considered related parties here and whose benefit would then disqualify that board member from being part of the decision. Okay, so remember influence and benefit. And conflict comes in many, many forms, and some of the confusion about conflict happens because of this, that conflicts can be real, financial, legally defined conflicts of interest, and we'll talk about those parameters, but they also can be perception, and as we know, perception can look like reality, and once something gets out as a perception, either within the organization or within the board culture or in the community, that perception can influence thinking in a way that might not be borne out by the facts. The other issue here to keep in mind is that there is actual financial conflict and as well the issue of conflict of loyalties. So oftentimes a conflict is not a real legally defined financial conflict, but it may be something that arises, for example, when a board member serves on two different boards, your board and one other board, where their loyalty in some decisions or actions might be tested by that, and it is a conflict of loyalty. It may or may not be an actual financial conflict, and it usually is not. There would have to be very specific circumstance to make that a conflict, but there is a conflict of loyalties there, and something that in general it's a good idea to disclose as a board member. Again, we're trying to shed more light on this and make it very transparent. Some other categories of conflict that we'll talk about and things that should become comfortable language for you are whether a conflict is excluded, whether it is managed or manageable, or whether it is absolutely prohibited. So an excluded conflict, for example, might be something like a bid process where a board member is involved, and that board member recuses him or herself, discloses the conflict, and the bid process goes ahead according to a process that you've had set up, which is competitive and fair. That actually could be a managed conflict or an excluded conflict if that board member proceeds with disclosure and recusal in an appropriate way. Now, an exception to this would be in a Head Start organization, for example. That would be a prohibited conflict because by Head Start regs, the organization cannot do business with a board member at all. So even though in other settings it would be permissible for a board, maybe not recommended, but permissible for a board member's business to do, to be a contractor, for example, for a not-for-profit. In a Head Start organization, that is a prohibited conflict. So we'll give some more examples of this as we go along. I want to introduce another poll question quickly here to see if we can pick out the one of these circumstances which is not a conflict. So which of these is not a conflict? A chief financial officer as a landlord renting to families who receive services, a board member who donates to another nonprofit that is involved in perhaps a very formal partnership with your community action agency, or when a board member's spouse is a part owner in an IT company that's hired by the organization. Which one of those, in your opinion, is not a conflict? The poll is open. It looks like we've got about another 25 seconds. Okay, the poll's closed, and we'll wait just a minute for the results. Okay. Okay, this is interesting, these responses. Many of you saw B, a board member who donates to another not-for-profit, as a conflict, 50% of the folks on the call. Several of you did not answer, and some of you saw C as the item that is not a conflict. The spouse is part owner of an IT company hired by the community action agency. So let's return and look at these through the lens of influence and benefit. B, who some folks did think was a conflict, is actually not a legally defined conflict of interest. Okay, this is one of those things that falls under the category of conflict of loyalties. So if a board member, for example, donates to another not-for-profit that you're in a partnership with, the terms of that partnership might be such that it would make this a legal conflict of interest, but it is unlikely to, because donations generally do not determine a conflict of interest. Remember who's benefiting here. The other organization may be benefiting, but that board member may also be donating to your organization. So there isn't an inherent financial conflict of interest there. In A, you have a key staff person, your chief financial officer, who is renting to families receiving services from the community action agency. The key questions there would be, clearly that person benefits. So one of the key questions is answered right up front. The CFO benefits personally through the rents that come in from families who receive services from the organization, but that is those individuals' funds, right? However, if we twisted this just a little bit to say that the community action agency is actually actively referring families to that landlord or is paying directly rents to that landlord, that would be a financial conflict of interest. So there is no way around the benefit question here. The question is that senior staff member in a position to influence decisions about that? So as a member of a senior team, if the community action agency was referring folks to them, and if they were actually handing cash from them to that individual in their personal role, that would be a formally defined conflict of interest. In this form and with this information, it still is a conflict that you would likely want to resolve, or at least make sure that the perception of conflict didn't damage you. Now, if you're in a setting, obviously, where there is no business relationship directly with the community action agency, it's not as much of a problem, but it still would be perceived as by many people as a conflict. In C, we've got a board member's spouse, part owner of an IT company hired by the community action agency. Now, that would be considered a conflict. It is a manageable conflict, or it potentially could be a manageable conflict, but it would require that the board member disclose that conflict and that they recuse themselves from any deliberation or conversation about that potential conflict. And if this is something, particularly if the IT company is working, for example, on the organization's financial system, it may end up bleeding over in an area where the organization decides that this is too much of a conflict and does not want to deal with the appearance of conflict in that situation. So again, back to the decision points. Does the individual in each of those cases have influence in the decision? And does that individual or their family members benefit financially or in some other tangible way? A lot of the times when we talk about conflict of interest, people come back to the idea of what would you say if you had to defend it on the 6 o'clock news? And that's a good screen. However, the thing to be said there is that it may be perfectly defensible. You may have broken no laws, you may have followed your own procedures, and you may be able to defend it publicly, but you may not ever get the chance. So if there is a perception out there that you're doing business with board members without a bid process, or you are doing business with members of your senior team in a way that benefits that staff member in addition to their community action salary, that may be front page news, and you may get a line and a half on page 9 to defend yourself. So it is a decision for the board to make as fiduciaries about whether or not they want to engage in that situation at all, because you may not be able to salvage it after the fact. So what are the risks that arise here? Oftentimes conflict actually begins because of a misunderstanding or an unclear loyalty within a board member's frame. So for example, if the board member is not seeing themselves as a decision maker in on a particular matter, they may not disclose a conflict, or they may not understand that something is a conflict because the organization hasn't spoken openly about what a conflict is. In that case, that conflict will come up and create additional unclear loyalties. So if there is an internal relationship, for example, in a situation where, say, a staff member is known by many members of the board, and some board members are critical of that individual and other board members are not, and people begin to take sides. Now, that's not a conflict of interest situation, but it creates conflicts of loyalty among board members that would then potentially influence conflict of interest decisions, because trust is such an important part of conflict of interest. So conflicts really have the potential to damage internal relationships, and they certainly have the potential to ruin a good reputation that an organization may have with its community. This is particularly important now because as community action programs are partnering more formally and more often with outside entities and are engaged in social enterprise, doing business in the business community where they may not have before, you are much more visible. So in that way, you are also much more scrutinized. And that scrutiny may create a perception of conflict where one does not actually exist. In a case where there is a conflict, so for example, if your organization has done business with a board member's business entity over the years, or the entity that is owned by the family member of a business, and there have not been procedures put in place to manage that conflict, funders in an audit situation may disallow those costs. And in some cases that I've been familiar with over the years, that can add up to a lot of funding when something is, a funding source decides to audit a series of decisions and comes back with the finding that those were not allowed costs because of the conflict interest not being handled. So although that's something that happens retrospectively, it's something to think about ahead of time. The IRS also has consequences for you that relate to conflict, and that can be either the worst case scenario there, which is that with insider dealings or legally defined conflicts of interest, you can lose your tax exempt status, or intermediate sanctions can be levied against the organization by the IRS. This often would happen in a case where a board member doing business with the organization, for example, was charging a higher than market value price for the service or the equipment or whatever it was that they are offering to the organization. And this would be seen by the IRS as excess benefit and therefore would trigger intermediate sanctions. Not something that you want. So why are we so scrutinized now? What's up with the timing that makes this an important issue and one that is very visible in your world? One is that public distrust of charities has grown, just as the public's distrust of government and business has grown. It's grown at a slower rate, and generally in national surveys, for example, that look at the levels of trust that the public holds for these sectors, the charity sector comes out looking pretty good. In other words, people have more faith in nonprofit organizations that do good work than they do necessarily in business or in government. But doing good isn't the only answer anymore. It's not enough. On top of that, we have to be able to show outcomes, and we have to be able to be very transparent around issues that relate to our finances. So people are looking. In high-profile conflict situations, oftentimes this attracts investigative reporting or other negative press that also adds to this problem. So when an organization goes down, and most community action networks in most states that I'm familiar with have had this happen at some point in their history over the years, where an organization is publicly found and shamed in some way because they haven't handled conflicts well. Once that happens once, the scrutiny goes up, and both within the funding organizations that you relate to and in your community overall, people begin to take a better look at it. In an era of tight budgets, which we have now, the scrutiny sometimes increases from inside the organization. So you may have employees, for example, that are feeling a little grumpy about the fact that they've not received a raise in several years, and then they see a business transaction between the organization and a board member, or between the organization and a board member's family, or they just perceive that business is being offered by the organization to an entity that a board member is affiliated with. That doesn't feel good when they're looking at their own salary that, because of rising healthcare costs or other reasons, may not be keeping pace with what their need is. So sometimes that scrutiny comes from inside as well. And as you get out there doing additional fundraising or running a business yourselves as either a social enterprise or perhaps under a separately incorporated for-profit entity that contributes to your not-for-profit bottom line, you're doing business, you're playing in a new sandbox, so to speak. You're working with partners that you've not worked with before, and you don't always know what their business ethics are. So people are watching that may have different definitions than you do. And the last point here relates to a generational issue that's happening in the philanthropic world, and that is that a transfer of wealth from the older generation of sophisticated philanthropists, for example, has left that wealth in the hands of much younger donors who have different interests. And while it may have been comfortable in their family history, for example, for a family foundation to give over time to the same cause in the same realm, a similar amount year after year, which is really the check writing kind of philanthropy, they're now interested in being more involved in the strategy that the organization is using to create impact and in what that impact is. So either as business people themselves or as folks with a conscience that see themselves as activists, they're giving around their activism, and they want to be more involved and understand what it is that you're doing with those funds, which again puts the spotlight on anything that looks like an interruption in the flow of funding from the source, in this case being the donor or the public entity, directly to the benefit of the people that your mission says you're in business to serve. Okay, so who is watching in community action, and when you look at putting a policy together, who has something to say that will inform that policy? We spoke about the IRS, and on the face of it, they ask fairly minimal things of a not-for-profit. They ask if you have a conflict of interest policy when you fill out your 990, and they ask if you monitor compliance. They don't ask to see your conflict, and some of their questions are not specific. But some of those that deal with, for example, internal transactions, what they're watching for is how many times you answer no to a question about monitoring. And if you line up a string of no's on particular sections in Section B, then you are likely to put yourself in the position of triggering an audit. So having the policy is not going to be enough in that case. Your reporting and monitoring also has to be in line with that policy. I spoke earlier about Head Start definitions, and when Head Start was reauthorized in 2007, they introduced a couple of specifics that really changed the landscape for community action programs that run Head Start programs. One of those was that they introduced specific family definitions that we'll talk about in just a moment for the first time in a specifically Head Start and community action setting. So the types of interested parties or related parties that will be involved now include a long list of family relationships. The other thing is that some conflicts were noted in a regulatory sense for the first time as prohibited conflicts. So the one I mentioned earlier, for example, was that if you are a Head Start organization, you are prohibited from doing business with any of your board members. And that is a definite. It's a clear prohibition that is not a conflict that can be managed. So when reauthorization happened and people began to interpret those regs and put them into place, there were a number of community action programs that I was working with at that time that had board members step down from the board because they were in a position, for example, as the officer of a bank that the organization did business with, or as a partner in a law firm that the organization did business with, where they had to choose between their role on the board and their role with that organization that was doing business with the CAP. Other funders also have policies that require you to include particular items in your conflict of interest policy and its implementation. So HUD is one example of this. There are many others, but HUD requires specific language around conflicts of interest and also requires that you report particular types of conflict of interest. And that can also extend to past the time that a board member is serving actively on your board. So in many of these cases, and we'll talk about this when we talk about the elements of a policy, you may be looking at one of the layers of your conflict of interest policy being the specific requirements of your funders. Additionally, if you are in the world of Medicaid service provision, a particular type of conflict of interest policy is required as part of a broader corporate compliance policy. So if you receive over $250,000 in Medicaid funds, you're required to abide by this and develop a comprehensive corporate compliance program that as part of that overall program that includes internal reporting and the ability of a corporate compliance officer to report directly to the board, bypassing the CEO or ED, very comprehensive. That will also include a conflict of interest policy that has particular language. Your independent auditors have always been interested in this, and they continue to look at it. They will look, and this is something that I've seen increase over the years, that auditors were always responsible for checking to see whether you respected the rules related to conflict of interest, but have not always asked to see every single disclosure or asked to see those disclosures annually. That's a much more common practice now. It should be. And it keeps you honest in terms of making sure that each board member is signing a disclosure form on an annual basis so that that is available to produce for any funder or for your independent auditor on request. The key piece to think about here, and this is particularly important for those of us that are in my home state, New York State, because our state law has just changed, is that state laws often pile additional requirements on top of what the IRS wants and on top of what your funders would like to see in a conflict of interest policy. So, for example, in New York State, over the past 2 years, we had the New York Nonprofit Revitalization Act come into being in 2013, and it specifically defines conflict and related parties and interested party transactions in a way that need to be used in that way in your policy definitions and in the bylaws of your organization. So that's an overlay that is an addition for a lot of organizations, and it's an important one. Okay, so here's a random question. Who took a public stance on conflict of interest recently? This was something that was reported widely in the popular media. Was it the U.S. Attorney General? Was it Angelina Jolie? Was it the CEO of the National Council of Nonprofits? Or are you not sure? Just a quick poll here. Off the top of your head. Who's interested in conflict of interest enough to say it out loud? Okay, just a few seconds left. Okay. Several of you were not sure. Several of you thought that this would have been the CEO of the National Council of Nonprofits, who does actually make fairly frequent comments on conflict of interest, so that was a good choice. And the U.S. Attorney General was the choice of several people as well. The answer actually here is Angelina Jolie, which is oddly enough, she's the one that in just recent, I believe it was within the last couple of weeks, came out. She has been serving on the board of an organization that works to remove landmines, and among the members of that board, 2 members were hired by the organization to do an internal assessment of the organization, and they were hired on a paid basis with no bid process. And in her perception, this was a conflict of interest, and I would tend to agree with that. And as a result of it, and as a result of their refusal to either step down and the organization's refusal to look at that transaction again, she decided to step down from the board. So that's just a random example of a conflict of interest that was recognized by another board member, and she felt at that point that it was a critical enough issue that she needed to step away from the organization because of it. Okay, so policies. We're here to talk about policies, and policies are the place to begin. It is, at least at a point in time, the place to define the parameters and also the procedures for dealing with conflict of interest. It's the place where you show your compliance with external requirements, and where at one point in time, if you do it in a way that includes key board members and key staff people, you know at that point that you are in agreement about those definitions. So it is the basis of a productive culture. So it's important to strategize the way in which a conflict policy is developed and processed by the board. It's too easy to just put a template in front of them that you as executive or you as board president have completed and call it a day. Please sign off on this. We're going to vote approval at the next meeting. That will get you a policy, but it won't get you a culture. So it is an agreement at one point in time. It may be a reference when questions come up, but if it's not supported culturally, it will be easily forgotten or turned aside or misinterpreted. So what goes in that policy that's going to be a decision maker for things that come up in the future and the basis of your culture? The first is definitions, and we'll cover a few of the key ones that are important there. The second is disclosure requirements and the process for disclosure. There also would be language around the prohibition on voting by interested members or related parties, and the review process by the committee or a full board. For example, in New York State, because of the recent law that came through Either an audit committee or the full board is part of that review process. And contemporaneous documentation is required. Now, although this is not required by every funder and every state, this is something that I would really recommend you put into place if it's not already, and that is that every time a decision is made around a conflict, it is documented either in the committee minutes or in the board minutes at the time that the decision is made. So here are a few of those definitions that would go into a policy. Most of these are around relationships, and remember the influence piece was one of the screens through which we're looking at conflict. So relatives are defined broadly here as a spouse, siblings, and their spouses. Well, we have 2 children here. Okay, children and children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, and domestic partners. Some of the regulations, for example, Head Start and also the New York State law also add to that adoptive children and stepchildren. So it's a very comprehensive definition. Related parties are referred to in a variety of ways, and this will be part of your conflict of interest policy, but a related party would be any director, officer, or key employee of the corporation that had an interest or that has a relative or an interest outside the corporation that is about to enter into transaction with that organization, which then leads us on to related party transaction, which is the arrangement itself, where that party that is an insider to the organization and has a primary loyalty to that organization also has a financial interest in a business arrangement that the organization is entering into. And last here, a key employee there is usually now required to be included in conflict of interest policies and definitions, and that really is anyone in a position to have substantial influence over corporate matters, so a CFO, a CEO, someone of that stature within the organization. And the last definition, an independent director, one who is not employed by the corporation and has no relative employed by the corporation for at least 3 prior fiscal years. Now, the specific year time limit here is part of the New York State law. Most state laws do have some time frame there. Some do not. Again, this is something that I would recommend you being conservative about, however. That independent director also has not received, nor has any family member of theirs received more than $10,000 in compensation during those years, and is not employed by and has no substantial financial interest in any entity that makes or receives payment from the corporation. Now, the IRS will not allow you to file your Form 1023 as part of the 990 process if you do not have a majority of your board members as independent. So the majority of any not-for-profit board that has tax-exempt status with the IRS must be considered independent. When 2 or more board members are related or co-own a business or have a close relationship of any kind, they cannot be counted as independent votes when you establish quorum. So this has a big impact if you have many relationships between board members, particularly family relationships or business relationships, because that perception about relationships between board members will influence the tone of conflict management within your organization, and generally not in a good way. So at least those relationships need to be disclosed, if not actively managed. So let's look at some of the aspects of culture now. When I say, is your policy accessible, what I'm talking about there is it clearly written? Is it easily understandable? Do you make reference to it often enough so that people feel very clear about how it can be used? And can your board and staff members describe conflicts that are specific to your situation? You know, storytelling and examples are very powerful teachers, and in developing culture, oftentimes a really good way to begin that or to rebuild it when an organization has struggled with conflicts in the past that were not well handled is to do storytelling about what are the what-ifs here. What story can we tell that would paint a picture of a potential conflict that we can then use our decision-making tools to make a decision about. So can board and staff members describe examples that work for you? Do your board and staff members model compliance? This is particularly important if you have a younger staff, because there are some differences in age cohorts in the workforce around how people decide what they will comply with. So when an older worker, for example, sees a policy, reads a policy, understands that policy to be the rules in that situation, they are more likely to rely on that kind of a structure. A younger leader is more likely to rely on what they see other people doing. So modeling when you are a board or staff leader is a really important piece of this, particularly speaking to younger workers. And do your decisions rest on the reasonable person standard and focus on the agency's best interest? One of the ways to pull things away from the personal, which is always the kiss of death in a conflict situation when personal emotion gets involved, is to take it back to the mission. What impact is this decision going to have on our overall mission as an organization? And let's look at that from all possible points of view, not just our own personal opinions, but what might people outside the organization think? What might our funders think? What might donors think? So that the organization's best interest in a broad range of opinions is the thing that takes precedence over personal emotion. So let's go to one more poll. Just a check on your conflict culture within your organization. So let us know with your vote whether your board is all on the same page, whether conflict of interest discussions are regular and comfortable, or whether conflict of interest discussions have caused bad feelings in the past. And if your situation is not represented here, but you think it's a key situation, please write into the question and answer box what that particular situation is very briefly.
Megan, just if I can interrupt for one quick second, just to sign you. The attendees can still continue to vote and everything, but just want to make sure everyone's system is working properly. So I know that this is not, this particular polling question does not have a not sure as one of the categories, because I know in the past a number of the attendees opted to select D, which is not sure. So we just wanted to make sure that everyone had the correct and non-working audio issues, if that makes sense.
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah, and in this particular poll, the last one, our situation is not represented here, really takes the place of that not sure. In other words, it doesn't have anything to do with me.
Right. Okay, just wanted to make sure everyone didn't have any technical difficulties that we didn't know about.
Okay. So we have several of you who don't see their situation here, and we have several of you that feel that their conflict of interest discussions are regular and comfortable, which is great news to hear, and just a couple that feel that they have had conflict of interest discussions that either are not working right now because the board isn't on the same page, or have had difficulties with conflict discussions in the past. So let's walk on to talk about some of the things that come up for community action agencies and things that are particular questions in this sector of the nonprofit world. Some of the potential or perceived cultures that we see often in conflict in community action are questions that arise around providing services to a board member, particularly a member of the target sector on a tripartite board. And we'll talk in just a moment about what the resolution of those issues are. But these are just some of the things that come up consistently. That is one. The other that comes up for all not-for-profits is board members doing business with the corporation. And particularly if your community action agency has been a business startup entity as a social enterprise or has helped folks in the community through a workforce development program begin small businesses, this then becomes a particular issue. You also have public sector board members that may be engaged in voting, for example, in their role as county exec or as mayor or as a member of city council on a piece of funding that comes to your organization or on a regulation that may have an impact on the organization. So this is not to say that these are exclusive. Many other conflicts happen in community action, but those are just a few that tend to come up. So let's look at things that would be considered an excluded conflict. In other words, they could be perceived as a conflict, but they can be handled simply with a disclosure and recusal from voting. A board member is employed by a local store where the community action agency does business unless that person is the owner or co-owner of that store and the level of the community action agency's business will impact their personal benefit. That is a very simple excluded conflict. So disclosing that relationship, which may be helpful to the organization down the road and does not include any damage to the organization at all, and having that member of the board recuse themselves if by any chance an issue comes up related to that organization, which it will not likely be because that employee in this scenario doesn't have active influence on the way that corporation spends its money. Board members applying for services offered by the Community Action Program are, as most of you probably know, not considered conflictual. It is something that, again, needs to be disclosed, and that board member would then be asked not to vote or participate in decisions that relate to that particular program. There are a couple of other pieces of that, and that is that assumes that that board member is getting the same service that anyone else who is eligible by the terms of funder policies is getting. So if a board member is receiving services from the organization and asking for special services or granted special services, that goes beyond an excluded conflict, but otherwise a simple disclosure is enough. A key staff member's daughter, the CFO's daughter, the CEO's daughter applies for a position in the office of the insurance company that handles the Community Action Agency's insurance. This is one of those it depends answers. If that is a decision-making role or a co-owner, where again the Community Action Agency's business would affect the payment to that person, then it would be considered a more difficult to manage conflict. In this case, it's a very simple disclosure and recusal. And a board member directing a city department where they are already, before they come on the board, receiving compensation, from that department and with responsibility for overseeing a grant, again, is not a conflict that needs active management, but it is a disclosure that should be made. Okay. Now, conflicts of interest or loyalty that are just a little more difficult to pin down, some of them appear here, and I'm going to note just a couple of them in the interest of time. If your board member is the vice president or president of a bank that's used by the Community Action Program, and that person's salary, for example, is determined by the level of business that they bring in, or your Community Action Program has all of their funds invested in that bank or is seeking a mortgage or a refinance through that bank. In that case, if you have a Head Start program, it's a prohibited conflict, and if you do not, it is a conflict to be managed very carefully. So you would not want to have the president of your board, for example, in that position. You would not want to have your treasurer or a member of your audit committee in that position, even if it were disclosed and managed. A board member's son runs a restaurant where the board meets regularly, sometimes in a small town. This may be difficult, but it is a conflict. It is something where the board's decision about where to meet and how to do that has an impact on the personal interest of the family member of a board. So depending on the circumstances in your location, that might result in a decision between the board resigning from the board in order to keep that relationship solid, or the member staying on the board and the board deciding to meet elsewhere. I'm going to pick out number 4 here, a partner in an automobile dealership where the Community Action Agency has bought several vehicles, serves on the board. This is one that those of you in New York State are probably fairly familiar with because it's been a high-profile one for us in recent years. But the deal here is really that if that is done according to a bid process and there is not a Head Start program involved, then this is a manageable conflict, but it's one where the perception could absolutely kill you as an organization. So it's a place where your board members really have to consider things carefully and weigh in. And the last one is an outright prohibited conflict, and that is that a board member who's a fundraising consultant would be paid to provide consulting services to the Community Action Program. Some of these seem as though people would never believe that this could be possible, and you know, I often get, well, that would never happen. It does, it has, and it's absolutely a prohibited conflict. So that means that in my role as a consultant to not-for-profits, for example, although I do strategic planning often with organizations, I can participate in a strategic planning process with a board that I'm on, but I cannot do that as a paid position, and I would not do it as an unpaid consultant leading that process because it's just too close, it's too conflictual. All right, and now let's look at a number of protective strategies as we come to the end of our time here. The conflict of interest policy is just the beginning, as I've said earlier, and developing that policy in such a way that it respects the layers that you are accountable to between the IRS, state law, other funding regulations, your CSBG standards. So, for example, the national standards that are being implemented now require that every board member have a signed disclosure every 2 years. So that's a basic requirement that in order to meet the national standard, your board will have to do. However, most of your policies and your independent auditor will probably require that you disclose every year. And what I'm suggesting here is that you disclose at the time you are either hired, if you're a CFO or CEO, or when you are first elected. So in your interview, before coming onto the board, it's appropriate for a governance or a board development committee member to ask, what are your potential conflicts of interest? Because you want to know how those might be managed when that person comes on. And you also want to diffuse the question of conflict of interest up front and then keep diffusing it. So when we say update and share disclosures here, it's useful for there to be a written disclosure at the time of election or hire and then annually, and anytime anything changes. But those disclosures usually are put in a drawer. They are put in a file. They are handed to the secretary or to the audit committee or to the board secretary for filing in the executive director's office or whatever the process is for getting them in a file without anyone else knowing what anyone's disclosure form says. One of the things that, in my opinion, really sheds light on this and can also help the organization discover how they are related to other entities in the community in a good way. For example, what other entities might the board be affiliated with that could result in partnerships for the organization down the road that are not conflictual, is to just share those disclosures. Put those on the board roster. What are the disclosed conflicts of each of those board members so that it stops being a secret? And here's where a board president that's a good facilitator can make all the difference in the world, and that is to just make disclosures a regular part of the meeting discussion. So having it be that whenever there is an issue that's coming up for a vote, that the board president very casually says, is there anyone in the room that has a conflict on this matter? A conflict on this matter might look like X, Y, Z, and they can describe an example that diffuses it as well so that people no longer feel as though a conflict is something to be embarrassed about or something that they don't want to disclose. And lastly, either disallow or create a very transparent bid process for board members doing business with the corporation. This is a risk that a lot of organizations just choose not to take, and others where you are in a situation where there might be one business in town that your board member runs that is the only person you can do business with decide that they will not disallow that relationship, but create an extremely transparent bid process that is consistent, predictable, always going to look the same no matter who is the person applying, and that it is even-handed and fair for folks within the organization. So there, hopefully, we have walked through and answered most of the questions that I asked up front, and you've had a little time to look at some of the things that might influence a policy or influence the way that you implement a policy. The thing that I want to emphasize more than anything else is that the policy is just the beginning, that the culture needs to be as transparent as it possibly can be, and that the more storytelling or example development that happens within your organization, the easier this will be, the less it will have a negative impact on relationships, and the less stressed it will be as a topic of conversation for your board and for the key staff members within your organization. Now, I'm going to stop here and ask if there are questions. Well, I put up the slide that deals with resources. There are some good policy templates here, as well as some sources of good information, and I would recommend that you at least check the cap law policy templates that are available on their website. Again, like the IRS regs, they are a good basis. They are not sufficient to meet the needs of all of your funders or all of your state laws, but if you're beginning a policy, they're a great way to get started, and they do include examples that relate to Head Start organizations and also to key staff members as well as board members. So, having said that, I'll stop talking now and ask if anyone has questions before we close.
Yes, Megan. If it's possible, a question has come in. Could you expand on your feedback regarding a board member who is a fundraiser consultant who is paid to provide consulting services? Could you expand on that point a little bit?
Sure, yeah. If you were thinking about hiring a fundraising consultant to, well, let me back up a minute. For many community action programs, fundraising is a new enterprise. And the natural instinct when you begin to start up a program or implement a practice that you don't feel comfortable with or haven't done in the past is to get some outside help. And sometimes that will come from a board member, a committee member, a community member, another not-for-profit, and sometimes you want to seek paid help. In this case, hiring someone who does fundraising consulting for a living who is also a board member is considered an outright prohibited conflict, because that person is then going to be receiving funds coming from you, potentially out of the funding that they have raised for your organization. So while it is great to have a fundraising consultant on the board, because you want somebody on the board that may be knowledgeable about this, you don't want to hire that person and have an outright financial conflict with them. You don't, because it is such a close conflict. In other words, they are going out to the community, they are asking the community to support you as a not-for-profit, and some of that money that is coming in then as part of your overall budget is going to that individual. Does that answer your question, Sanji?
Yes, that was a question that has come in, so that's great. Thank you.
All right, well, any last-minute questions you can send to me through the chat window. I did want to remind everybody that this webinar is being recorded and will be posted on the partnership's website, as well as available in the CSBG TNTA Resource Center. It doesn't look like we have any other questions coming in, so I did just want to say thank you so much to Megan. This was a very insightful presentation, and I'm sure people will be very excited about the resources that are linked at the end of the presentation, which will be made available to the network. So any closing remarks you'd like to make, Megan?
No, thank you very much. Just to say that if folks do have follow-up questions that are either too involved or things that you didn't want to speak about publicly, you're welcome to give me a direct call or send me an email to ask anything in follow-up offline. I'd be happy to do that as well. So thanks very much to everybody who participated, and thank you at the partnership.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Have a great day, everybody.